topic is going to be about perfection, and we're going to look at the word perfect because this is something that people can have trouble with, and we're going to explain how perfection relates to us in the Bible. We've talked about just recently about God being perfect and us being imperfect, and that's kind of where we're starting as a starting point, and we're going to take on the question of when do we become perfect, and how does that happen, and when are we considered perfect? And so perfection, I'm going to tell you right in advance what we're going to say. Perfection applies to believers from three different viewpoints, and that's kind of important to understanding it, because sometimes the text actually mixes these viewpoints together, and you have to say, okay, he's using the word perfection like this over here, but then 2 verses later he's using it in this way over here. So without this understanding, the Bible can be confusing in some places. And we'll actually look at some verses that are like that, where two different uses of perfection are done. So um, the one that we know the best, I think, is that we are not perfect, as seen by ourselves and other people on this planet with us. We know that we're not perfect. We make mistakes, and we're not perfect in that sense. That's easy for everybody to grasp. But there's also a usage of perfect that is different from that, and that is that we are declared perfect as seen by God through Jesus. Okay, so every believer is declared perfect by God because of Jesus covering him, because it's sort of like God is looking through Jesus at us, and we're all cleaned up and declared perfect. And so God says, yeah, we're acceptable to him, we're perfect in that sense. So we are declared perfect, even though we aren't perfect in our viewpoint. But from God's viewpoint, through Jesus, we are declared perfect. And that is true of all believers. And the third usage that the Bible has for the word perfect here is that we will be made perfect as seen by God. So we will become truly perfect, not just declared perfect, but made perfect. And that happens, well, we'll talk about that when we get to those verses. So the Bible uses perfect in all of these ways. And as I said before, you can be confused if you don't understand how it's using them. And we'll look at lots of examples here. So the basic stuff, information that we covered before, and we'll just kind of quickly go through it here, is the idea that God is perfect, without any flaws, without anything. And in fact, he is perfect in a way that makes him beautiful. And that's a hard thing for us to understand. We have very little understanding. We don't know that many things in our lives that are so perfect that they become beautiful. But there are some things that I have seen, and some things I've seen done, that I would say, boy, that was done perfectly, and there's kind of a beauty to that. And in its perfection, it has a beauty to it. And maybe you've experienced that sort of thing in some things that you've seen before. Something was done just so right, or said so right, or something was created that was just exactly perfect. And because it's so perfect, it has a beauty to it. And God has that beauty. His perfection makes him beautiful. And his perfection is such that any imperfection cannot exist in his presence. And that's an important thing to understand, especially for the people who think that they're going to go to heaven and meet God. Um, they cannot be imperfect in God's presence. And it isn't that God would attack them because they're imperfect. It's simply that imperfection can't exist in his presence. And it would just cease to exist in his presence. So it's the same thing as darkness and light. Darkness is gone when the light shines into it. So if you have a dark room, you'd say it's dark in there, but you point a flashlight in there and the darkness is gone. And it's the same way. The perfection of God is like light, and darkness is the absence of light. And so imperfection is the absence of perfection. And so the result of being in the presence of perfection like God um, causes imperfection to not exist. I hope that kind of, it's hard to explain, but I hope that it makes some sense. So, but we aren't, and we humans were originally, but we aren't perfect now. And Adam and Eve were created perfect. We know that from the Bible. Genesis 1:31 says, after he had finished all of creation, he says, and God saw that all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And so it was, God judged it all to be very good. But we know what happened after that, is that Adam and Eve sinned. They rejected what God told them about doing. And because of that, they became imperfect. And not only did they become imperfect, but it changed their nature such that they now pass this new nature, this fallen nature, down to their children. And so beginning with them, their nature changed when they became imperfect, but they also now pass that down to us, their children. And so when their children become old enough to know right from wrong, they sin, and they also become imperfect in God's eyes, and therefore ultimately everyone becomes imperfect. And so that's where we're left off, is that we are imperfect, and we saw that from the first use of imperfection, is that we are imperfect and we work towards being perfect. And so the first verses I'm going to look at come from Ephesians 4:11 through 14. And it says, he gave some, this is God, of course, he gave some who are apostles, and some who are prophets, and some who are evangelists, and some who are pastors, and some who are teachers, for the perfecting of the holy ones. Okay, so that's their job. The apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers, those people are given to us by God for the purpose of perfecting us. And so those people, that is their mission. And it says, for the perfecting of the holy ones, for the work of the ministry, for the building up of the body of the Messiah. Okay, so that's all of the things that those people are responsible for. And we talked about apostles and prophets and all that in a lesson quite some time ago now. And so each one of these has a particular role. And we talked about the idea that apostles don't seem to be possible now. The idea of an apostle is a one-time thing that happened and it won't happen again. So anyway, the verse has been saying that these people have been given by God to us for the purpose of perfecting us. And it continues by saying, until we all shall be one entity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God, and one perfect man with the dimensions of the stature of the maturity of the Messiah. That's a tough verse. We'll come to that on the next slide. Neither shall we be children who are shaken and troubled, for every wind of crafty teaching of the children of men, those who plot to seduce by their cunning. So he says, once we become perfect, or we work towards perfect, and that's our goal. And as we become farther away from being children, we are no longer shaken or troubled by everybody who comes along with a new teaching or a new idea. And we know that those are false teachings and we can reject those. And so we become no longer children in the faith, but we grow up and we reach a maturity that he's talking about. So that is our experience of life, is that these people are sent to us to perfect us, or move us towards perfection. But we also do understand that it isn't possible for us to be perfect in this life, in these bodies. That just isn't a possibility. But we work towards that, becoming better and better as we go along, and that's how our lives are. Another verse that talks about that is, or no, sorry, this is the same verse. It said, one perfect man with the dimensions of the stature of the maturity of the Messiah. And so this is a complicated idea that Paul is describing there. What he means is that we are all moving toward becoming one unity. Okay, so all Christians should be moving towards becoming a unity, a mature unity, and that unfortunately doesn't seem to be the case so much in reality, but that was the idea, is that all Christians would move toward becoming one unity, and in that unity they would have the same dimensions as the Messiah, he says. But he doesn't mean physical dimensions. He's not talking about we should have the same height or shoulders or waist or weight measurements, none of those things. He's talking about spiritual maturity, and he says that there. He talks about the maturity. He means spiritual maturity. And so he says that we should be growing up towards being that one perfect man, all of us together, with the dimensions of the stature of the spiritual maturity of the Messiah. And yes, we all work towards that. Few people get close to that. There are more people who kind of are slowly working and may never get to where the other people have gotten to. And so that is Christianity in our time. There are people who are just not really moving towards perfection, and others who are much closer to perfection. And that's because Satan has obviously been messing around. He's been throwing out bad teachings and all sorts of stuff for a couple thousand years, and Christianity has kind of been shredded because of that. So that's not the only thing that perfects us. He talked about those people, the prophets, the apostles, all of those people who are sent by God to help us grow, but that isn't the only thing that helps us grow. And he talks to Timothy about that in 2 Timothy. He says, every writing which is written by the Spirit is profitable for teaching, for correction, for direction, and for a course in righteousness, that the man of God will be perfect and perfected for every good work. And so he had been speaking about people who were charged with helping us grow, the prophets and the apostles and all of those. And now he says the Word of God, the Bible, also helps us grow towards perfection. So we have both of those things that can be sources of growth for us. And so if we aren't sure that what we're being taught by one person is correct, we can go to another person, or we can go to the Bible and see that it's correct. And so we have all of these things here that help us to move towards that perfection that we should be moving towards in our lives. But we know that Paul was not perfect. This is a well-known verse. And when Paul actually says that, he says, I have not yet received it, neither am I yet perfect, but I run so that I may obtain that thing for which Yeshua the Messiah apprehended me. So he says, I'm not perfect yet, but I run, I keep moving on, I keep going forward towards that. And then verse 13, he says, my brethren, I do not consider myself to have obtained it, but I know one thing, I have forgotten that which is behind me, and I reach out before me. So he's saying there, is everything in my past is behind me. I'm not looking back. I'm moving forward, and I run ahead to move towards that perfection. I don't let the things I've done in the past be allowed to drag me down and keep me from becoming what I should be and moving towards that perfection that I should have. And so he says, I've forgotten. He doesn't literally mean forgotten. He means I've put those things behind me. And now I reach out before me and I move forward towards that perfection. And verse 14, he continues and he says, and I run toward the goal to take the victory of the calling of God from on high in Yeshua Messiah. So he's running towards his goal of the calling that he was given and what he was supposed to do. And so his goal is to do everything that the Messiah wants him to do. And we know that that is in part perfection, but there are also good works and other things that we are supposed to do. And verse 15, he continues with using the word perfect. And now here is an example where he uses perfection in one of those other ways. And he says, let those who are perfected, therefore, be governed by these things. So what he's saying there is those people who are perfected should be doing the things that I've been teaching in the previous verses, which we didn't cover. And so he's using perfection here in a different way. In the first usage of perfection, he says he himself is not yet perfect. We understood that in the flesh we are not perfect, none of us, and we run toward it. We never achieve it, but that is what we do in this life. And so now we see him using perfected in another way. And here he is saying those who are perfected, and he means perfected through Jesus. So perfected as God sees us through Jesus. And so because of Jesus' coverage for us, we are declared perfected. And that happened when we became believers. And so the minute that we were believers, we were declared perfected, but yet we were not perfect. And we now move towards perfection. I know that's complicated, but I hope you're understanding it. And so he says these people, all believers is what he's really saying. And believers might have been a better word for him to choose here. But he uses those who are perfected, which means the same thing as believers, because all believers are declared perfected as God sees it through the Messiah's covering. And so that's what he means here. And so this is one of those cases I talked about where perfect is used within like 3 or 4 verses apart in different ways. And so this one can be really confusing if you don't know what. And if you look at other translations, you can see that they're struggling to write it, do their translation to try to make it clearer exactly what is meant in both of these uses of perfection. So we are perfected in the Messiah. And we'll look at a verse, a bunch of verses here that talk about that. And here's one that talks about people who were not perfected in the Old Testament, but are perfected now because of Jesus. And so this comes from Hebrew 10. And he says, for the law, the Torah, had a shadow in it of good things that were coming. It was not the essence of those matters. Because of this, while they were offering those sacrifices every year, this is the priest offering sacrifices at the temple, they could never perfect those who offered the sacrifices. For if they had perfected those people who were offering sacrifices, doubtless they would have ceased from their offerings, because their conscience would not have been buffeted by sin once they had themselves been purged. So he says in the Old Testament, people couldn't be perfected by those sacrifices. And so they continued on being buffeted by their sins. The memory of their sins came back to haunt them, and they always felt guilty for the things. And that's because they weren't perfected as God sees us in that way. So, so he says that the people in that time, the Old Testament times, their consciences kept on bothering them because of the sins that they had committed, and the sacrifices that they offered did nothing to stop their consciences from beating up on them because of those sins. So the sacrifices they did nothing to perfect them. And so verse 14, we skip ahead to verse 14 here, where he uses the word perfected again. And he says, now this is for us believers in our time. For by one offering, Yeshua has perfected those who are sanctified by him for eternity. And so we are perfected, as I said before, when we became believers and accepted Jesus, we are perfected as God sees us because he sees us through Jesus. And we are perfected, and we also know that we are sanctified, made holy by him for eternity. So that's one of those big differences between the Old Testament and the New Testament, is that God now sees us as perfected, and our conscience no longer bothers us because of the things that we have done in the past that were wrong. And so we're made perfect through the Messiah, is how this is being used here. And our consciences should no longer prick us about our past sins, but Satan will still try to do this. I'm sure people who are mature in the faith have seen all of this. Satan tries to bring up things that we've done in the past and say, oh, look at the terrible thing you did there. And that's the past. Just like Paul was saying before, those things are in the past, but they don't drag me down. I run forward, I move forward towards perfection, and what's gone is gone. So those two verses link up pretty well here. Okay, now we're talking about that future perfection, that time that will come when we will be perfected, and not just perfected through the Messiah as God sees us, but perfected in our own right. And so the first verse that I have about this comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And it says, for we know partially and we prophesy partially, but when perfection shall come, then that which is partial shall be nothing. And so here he doesn't make a big story about this perfection, but he says, when perfection shall come. So there's going to be a time when perfection will come. And when perfection comes, then this partiality that we know and partiality that we speak will be nothing. We will know everything, and we will speak everything, and there will be nothing that is unknown to us. And so he's talking about that time when we get the new bodies, and after the time of the second coming. And so now he doesn't mention the second coming, or he doesn't mention when this will happen, but he just says when perfection shall come. So he says there is a future perfection shall come, and we know that didn't come any time from Paul's time through to our time. We would have heard about that, and so that is still something that's in our future as well. And so Paul is just saying that there's a future time when we will be perfected, and when he says we, he means all believers. Okay, now here from Hebrews is another place where it talks about being perfect in that way. It says, persons of whom the world, now remember Hebrews 11 is the faith chapter. It talks about all the people from the Old Testament who were men of faith. And in here we're going to see that they all died without receiving that promise that was given to them through their faith, but they will in a time receive it. So it says, persons of whom the world was not worthy. That's the people of faith from the Old Testament that he listed. And they were as wanderers in desert places, and in mountains, and in caves, and caverns of the earth. And all of these, concerning whom there is a testimony of their faith, did not receive the promise, because God provided for our benefit that they would not be made perfect without us. Okay, so what the author is referring to here is those people of faith throughout history, all the Old Testament people that he talked about, and I'm sure you know that chapter. And so what the author says is that they will not be made perfect without us also being made perfect. So we're going to be all made perfect at the same time. Those Old Testament people who are people of faith, and us as well, believers in the present time, perhaps dead when it actually happens, but all believers, everyone will be made perfect at that same time. And this is important in theology as well, but it's also important to understand perfection. And so he talks about us, and so when he says us and we, he says he's including himself and all of the believers that he's talking to. And so he's talking to the believers that this letter was sent to, and this is Hebrews. We're not exactly sure who it was sent to. And we also know that he's including all of the believers to come with that, because nothing has changed since then. There was nobody made perfect since that time. And so it includes all believers to come, including us, and it includes all the way in the future up into the last believer, whoever that will be, the last person to become a believer before the second coming. And so neither the Old Testament people of faith nor the New Testament people of faith have been made perfect. And as I talked about right at the start, because we haven't been made perfect, it isn't possible for us to be in heaven with God because of the imperfection that we have and retain after death. We would just be destroyed. But going back to the main point that's being made here, he says we will all be made perfect together, and at the second coming is what he's talking about. And so this is more evidence from the Bible. It's off topic here, but the dead can't be in heaven with God, and despite what they believe, because the imperfection that they retain would make that impossible for them. Okay, so summarizing this message here, we talked about Adam and Eve being created perfect, and because of their sin, we received a sinful nature when we were born. And because of that sinful nature, it results in us sinning and becoming imperfect. And because of that imperfection, we can't get rid of it. There's nothing that will make that go away. And so it can be hidden, and that's what Jesus does. He covers those imperfections for us. And ultimately what will happen is a change will happen, that we will be made perfect. But right now, we aren't that way. And so as we talked about it right at the start, there are three different ways that this applies to us, to believers in our time, and three different viewpoints, really. And so from the viewpoint of ourselves and others, we are not perfect, and we recognize that. Any true Christian recognizes that. We are perfecting ourselves, running, as Paul talks about, running towards that perfection. So we are perfecting ourselves in this time by the word and by the pastors and teachers and apostles and prophets and everything else that was listed in that verse that we saw. So we are in a process of perfecting ourselves because we are not perfect in that sense. And this perfection also prepares us to do good works. We saw that in one of the verses as well. So that's that one usage of perfection, where as we see it ourselves and others see us. But the other, or the second one, is that we are declared perfect as seen by God through Jesus. Okay, so what that really means is that Jesus makes us look perfect to God. So he is covering over the things that we do. He's atoning for them is another way to say that. And so the wrong things that we do, he atones for, and we continue to look perfect to God because of that. Because of that, in that verse that we saw, our consciences do not prick us about previous sins. Satan may be trying to prick us about previous sins and bring them up and slow us down because of that. But our consciences are not like that. Our consciences are quiet because the sin has been atoned for by Jesus. And the third usage is that we will be made perfect as seen by God. So we will really truly be perfect, not just declared perfect and covered over by Jesus to look perfect, but indeed made perfect in new bodies. So at the second coming, we will be perfected and receive new bodies. And that's a critical piece of that is these new bodies, because the bodies we currently have now are part of our problem with sin, is that they try to convince us to do things that are wrong. And so what we've seen in this study here is that the Bible uses the word perfect in all three of these ways. And as we also saw in that one set of verses, it's necessary to be able to understand these three different viewpoints. Otherwise, the verses that you read may trip you up and you won't understand exactly what they're trying to say.